January 22nd, 1879. The burning African sun hung over the dry hills of southern Africa as thousands of British soldiers marched through Zulu land, believing victory was certain. The mighty British Empire had conquered nations across the world. Their rifles were advanced, their uniforms were feared, their commanders believed no African army could truly challenge them. But that confidence was about to be shattered. Earlier that same day, only a few miles away from a tiny mission station called Battle of Rorke's Drift, disaster struck the British army at the terrifying Battle of Isandlwana. More than 20,000 Zulu warriors descended on the British camp like a human storm. The sound of war cries rolled across the hills, shields thundered, spears flashed under the sun, and within hours, one of the greatest military powers on earth was completely destroyed. British soldiers were stabbed where they stood. Officers were hunted down as they tried to escape. Some attempted to flee on horseback, only to be overtaken and killed. The battlefield became a sea of bodies, smoke, blood, and broken rifles. Over 1,300 British troops died that day. For the Zulu kingdom under King Cetshwayo Kampande, it was an unbelievable victory. The warriors had proven that courage and discipline could stand against rifles and artillery. But the battle was not over. After the slaughter at Isandlwana, around 4,000 Zulu warriors broke away from the main army and began marching toward a small outpost nearby. That outpost was Rorke's Drift. Inside it were barely 150 British soldiers. Some were sick, some were exhausted, some had never even fought in a major battle before. And now, without warning, they were about to face thousands of furious Zulu warriors alone. One soldier reportedly looked into the distance and saw dark lines moving across the hills. At first he thought they were shadows. Then he realized the terrifying truth. The Zulus were coming. Rorke's Drift was never meant to survive a massive attack. The station itself was small and isolated, sitting near the Buffalo River in what is now South Africa. It was not a fortress, it was not heavily armed. In fact, it was mostly a missionary station and supply depot made up of simple buildings with thin walls and open ground around them. If the Zulus attacked in full force, there was almost nowhere to hide. Inside the outpost, panic slowly began spreading after survivors from the disaster at Isandlwana arrived with horrifying news. Their uniforms were torn, some were wounded, others could barely speak from shock. "The camp is gone." Those words changed everything. Lieutenants John Chard and Gonville Bromhead immediately understood the danger. If thousands of Zulu warriors were marching toward them, retreat might seem like the safest option. But there was one huge problem. The hospital building was filled with injured soldiers who could not run. Leaving them behind would mean certain death. So instead of fleeing, the officers made a desperate decision that would become legendary in military history. They would stay and fight. The men quickly began turning mealie bags filled with corn into defensive walls. Wooden biscuit boxes were stacked into barricades. Every second mattered. Sweat poured from exhausted soldiers as they dragged supplies across the ground while constantly looking toward the hills. Then came another terrifying report. The Zulu army was close, very close. Some British soldiers could already hear distant chanting carried by the wind. Others climbed onto rooftops trying to spot movement in the fading daylight. Then suddenly, dark figures appeared across the hillsides. Hundreds, then thousands. Zulu warriors spread across the landscape like a black wave moving toward the tiny station. Many carried stabbing spears known as assegais. Others held old rifles taken from previous battles. Their cowhide shields reflected the evening sun as they advanced with terrifying confidence after their victory at Isandlwana. One British soldier quietly whispered what many were thinking. "We are all going to die tonight." As the sun slowly dipped toward the horizon, the atmosphere inside Rorke's Drift became unbearable. Every man knew the odds. Around 150 British defenders stood behind weak barricades made of corn bags and biscuit boxes, while nearly 4,000 Zulu warriors approached from the hills. The air felt heavy with fear, dust, and the smell of gunpowder. Then the first Zulu war cries exploded across the valley. The sound froze the blood of many soldiers. It echoed through the hills like thunder. The Zulus moved fast, far faster than the British expected. Warriors sprinted through the tall grass carrying shields and assegais, their feet pounding against the earth as they rushed toward the station from multiple directions. And then, the first shots rang out. British rifles cracked through the evening air in rapid succession. Smoke burst from the barrels as soldiers fired directly into the charging lines. Some Zulu warriors fell instantly, but the others kept coming. Closer, closer, closer. The defenders quickly realized something terrifying about the Zulu fighters. They were fearless. Even as bullets tore through their ranks, many continued charging straight toward the barricades without slowing down. Some leapt over fallen bodies, while others used the dead as cover to push forward. Soon the entire station erupted into chaos. Gunfire flashed non-stop. Men screamed in pain. Zulu bullets struck walls and smashed through windows. Spears flew over barricades. Smoke covered the battlefield so heavily that some soldiers could barely see a few feet ahead. At one section of the defense line, the Zulus nearly broke through immediately. British soldiers shoved rifles through gaps in the barricades and fired point-blank into charging warriors. Bodies piled up against the mealie bags as wave after wave kept coming. But the attack was only beginning, because while the British focused on the outer walls, other Zulu warriors were already moving toward the hospital building. And inside that building were wounded men trapped with nowhere to escape. The hospital building soon became the most dangerous place in all of Rorke's drift. Inside were wounded British soldiers too weak to fight properly. Some lay on beds unable to move. Others could barely hold rifles because of fever or injuries suffered earlier in the campaign. And now the Zulus were coming straight for them. The sound of gunfire outside grew louder and louder as warriors surrounded the building. Bullets smashed through windows. Spears pierced through cracks in the walls. Smoke drifted into the rooms as terrified patients realized they were trapped. Then the Zulus reached the doors. Heavy blows slammed against the wood. British soldiers inside fired desperately through windows and openings, but the attackers kept advancing. One defender later described hearing the terrifying sound of assegais scraping against the walls while war chants echoed outside. Suddenly flames appeared. The roof had been set on fire. Panic exploded inside the hospital. If the soldiers stayed, they would burn alive. But if they ran outside, thousands of Zulu warriors waited in the darkness. Private John Williams and a few others made a desperate decision. Instead of escaping through the main exits, they began smashing holes through the interior walls room by room using rifle butts and picks. The wounded had to be dragged through smoke-filled chambers while bullets flew around them. At any moment, the Zulus could burst inside, and then they did. Warriors smashed through doors and windows, fighting hand-to-hand with British defenders inside the burning hospital. Rifles became clubs, bayonets stabbed in close quarters. Smoke blinded everyone as flames spread across the roof. One room at a time, the defenders pulled injured men through narrow holes in the walls, while Zulu warriors hacked at the doors behind them. It became a race against death. Some soldiers escaped only seconds before entire rooms burst into flames. Others never made it out at all. Outside the hospital, the British defense line was also starting to collapse. Night finally covered Rorke's drift, but the battle only became more terrifying. The burning hospital lit the battlefield with an orange glow as smoke rose into the African sky. Shadows moved everywhere. British soldiers could barely tell friend from enemy as gunfire flashed non-stop across the barricades. Then the Zulus launched another massive assault. Warriors rushed forward, screaming battle cries that echoed through the darkness. Some fired captured rifles into the station while others charged with assegais raised high above their heads. The British defenders were exhausted. Many had been fighting for hours without rest, their shoulders burned from repeatedly firing rifles. Ammunition was running low in some sections, and dead bodies were piling up against the barricades so heavily that soldiers had to push them aside just to keep firing. At one point, the outer defense line became impossible to hold. Lieutenant John Chard realized his men were stretched too thin. If the Zulus broke through completely, everyone inside the station would be overwhelmed within minutes. So he gave the order to fall back. Under constant attack, British soldiers abandoned part of the perimeter and retreated to a smaller inner barricade built from biscuit boxes. The movement had to happen carefully. One mistake could open a gap large enough for hundreds of Zulu warriors to pour through. As the defenders pulled back, the Zulus stormed into the abandoned section of the station. Now the fighting became incredibly close. Some warriors reached the barricades and tried climbing over them while British soldiers stabbed with bayonets from the other side. Rifles fired at point-blank range. Men fought only feet apart, separated by stacks of corn bags soaked with blood. One British soldier later admitted he could see the whites of the attackers' eyes in the firelight. The noise became unbearable. Gunshots, screaming, war chants, crackling flames, and through all of it, the Zulus kept attacking again and again and again. But something shocking was beginning to happen. Against all odds, the tiny British force was still holding. Hour after hour, the battle continued. Most soldiers at Rorke's Drift had already lost track of time. The night felt endless. Smoke burned their eyes. Their ears rang from constant rifle fire. Some men were so exhausted they could barely reload properly anymore. But the Zulu warriors still refused to give up. Again and again, they charged the barricades with terrifying courage. The defenders could hardly believe what they were seeing. Even after suffering terrible losses, the attackers kept returning through the darkness. Some crawled low to avoid bullets, others used shadows and burning buildings as cover while moving closer to the British line. Then came one of the most dangerous moments of the entire battle. A group of Zulu fighters managed to get dangerously close to the inner barricade near the cattle enclosure. In the confusion and darkness, several warriors almost broke through a weak section of the defense. British soldiers rushed to stop them in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Bayonets thrust forward. Rifle stocks smashed into shields. Men wrestled in the dirt only feet away from burning buildings. For a moment, it looked like the station might finally fall. Corporal William Allen was among those fighting desperately along the barricades. Soldiers fired so rapidly that rifle barrels became dangerously hot to touch. Ammunition boxes were ripped open in panic as runners carried bullets from one position to another. Every defender knew one thing: if the firing stopped for even a minute, thousands of warriors could pour inside. Meanwhile, outside the station, the Zulus filled the night with haunting chants and drum-like rhythms made by striking shields and weapons together. The sound echoed through the valley, creating fear even among experienced soldiers. Some British defenders later confessed they truly believed they would not survive until morning. And yet, somehow, the line still held. Then, sometime after midnight, the attacks suddenly slowed. The gunfire became less frequent. The war cries faded slightly into the darkness. For the first time in hours, an uneasy silence began creeping across Rorke's drift. But nobody dared celebrate, because they all knew the Zulus could attack again at any moment. The silence terrified the British soldiers almost as much as the fighting. After hours of non-stop attacks, the sudden quiet felt unnatural. Men stood behind blood-stained barricades gripping rifles with trembling hands, staring into the darkness beyond the station. Nobody trusted the silence. Some believed the Zulus were regrouping for one final massive assault that would finish them before dawn. Others feared the warriors were sneaking closer under cover of darkness. The defenders were exhausted beyond words. Many had not eaten properly in hours. Some had wounds they barely noticed during the chaos of battle. Faces were blackened with smoke, and uniforms were soaked with sweat and blood. Yet nobody could sleep. Not with thousands of enemy warriors somewhere out there. Occasionally, gunshots cracked through the night as nervous soldiers fired at movement in the darkness. Shadows seemed to move everywhere beyond the barricades. Every sound made men tighten their grip on their rifles. Then, before dawn, the Zulus attacked again. The war cries returned suddenly, exploding out of the darkness with terrifying force. Warriors rushed toward the station once more, determined to break the exhausted defenders at last. British rifles answered immediately. Flashes of gunfire lit up the battlefield like lightning. Some Zulu fighters reached the barricades again, hurling spears and trying to force openings between the mealie bags. The defenders fired as quickly as they could, knowing this assault might decide everything. But something had changed. The attacks no longer had the same overwhelming strength as earlier in the night. The Zulus had suffered terrible casualties. Bodies covered the ground around the station. Many warriors had fought continuously for hours after already marching long distances and battling earlier in the day. Even their incredible courage had limits. Still, they fought on. As the eastern sky slowly began turning gray, British soldiers realized they had survived the night. But dawn revealed a horrifying sight. The ground around Rorke's drift was covered with dead and wounded warriors. Some lay against the barricades where they had fallen during charges. Others were scattered across the open field beyond the station. Smoke still rose from burned buildings as the first sunlight touched the battlefield. And then, in the distance, the defenders saw movement again. More figures were approaching. As dawn spread across the battlefield, fear returned instantly to the exhausted defenders. British soldiers squinted toward the distant hills and saw large groups of figures moving again. After surviving an entire night of horror, many believed the Zulus were preparing for one final attack to wipe them out completely. Some men immediately grabbed rifles and rushed back to defensive positions despite barely being able to stand. There were only around 150 defenders left alive inside the ruined station, and many of them were wounded. Ammunition was scattered everywhere. Buildings were destroyed. The hospital had become a burned-out shell. If the Zulus attacked again in full strength, the British doubted they could survive another assault. Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead reportedly walked among the exhausted soldiers, encouraging them to stay ready. Nobody knew how much longer they could hold. Then something unexpected happened. The Zulu warriors in the distance stopped advancing. Instead, many simply stood watching the battered station from afar. For hours they had attacked fearlessly, charging directly into rifle fire again and again. But now the battlefield told a brutal story. Hundreds of warriors had been killed around the outpost, and many more were wounded. The defenders slowly realized the Zulus were no longer preparing for a major assault. They were withdrawing. One by one, groups of warriors began moving away from Rorke's drift and disappearing into the hills. The British could hardly believe it. Against impossible odds, they had survived. The tiny station that should have fallen within minutes had somehow held off thousands of Zulu fighters for nearly an entire day and night. Soon afterward, British reinforcements finally arrived at the station. But when they saw the battlefield, even hardened soldiers were stunned. Bodies covered the area around the barricades. The smell of smoke and death filled the air. And standing inside the shattered defenses were exhausted survivors who looked more like ghosts than victorious soldiers. The Battle of Rorke's Drift was over. But the story of what happened there was only beginning to spread across the world. News of the battle spread across the Anglo-Zulu War like wildfire. At first, the British Empire was humiliated by the shocking disaster at Isandlwana. One of the strongest armies in the world had been destroyed by Zulu warriors armed mostly with spears and courage. Newspapers back in United Kingdom were filled with fear and outrage. People could not believe the British army had suffered such a defeat. Then came the story of Rorke's Drift. Suddenly, the Empire had something else to talk about. The tale sounded almost unbelievable. Roughly 150 British soldiers surviving wave after wave of attacks from nearly 4,000 Zulu warriors inside a tiny mission station in southern Africa. To many in Britain, it became a symbol of courage and discipline under impossible conditions. The defenders of Rorke's Drift were treated like heroes. An astonishing 11 Victoria Crosses, the highest military award for bravery in Britain, were given to soldiers involved in the battle. It remains one of the largest numbers of Victoria Crosses ever awarded for a single action. Men like John Chard and Gonville Bromhead became famous almost overnight. But historians would later debate something important. Was Rorke's Drift celebrated so heavily partly because Britain needed a heroic story to distract people from the humiliation at Isandlwana? Some believe the answer is yes. Because while the defense of the station was undeniably brave, the Zulu warriors themselves also showed extraordinary courage. Again and again they charged directly into deadly rifle fire, fighting with incredible determination even after suffering devastating casualties. In many ways, both sides left behind legends that day. The Zulus proved they could defeat one of the world's greatest empires in open battle, and the defenders at Rorke's Drift proved how far desperate men could go when survival was their only option. But even decades later, one chilling question still remains. What did the battlefield actually look like after the fighting finally ended? When the smoke finally cleared at Rorke's Drift, the full horror of the battle became impossible to ignore. The ground surrounding the station looked like something from a nightmare. Bodies of Zulu warriors lay scattered across the field, around the barricades, and beside the burned hospital. Some had fallen only a few feet from the British lines after charging directly into gunfire. Broken shields, assegis, and rifles covered the battlefield alongside blood-stained mealie bags and shattered biscuit boxes. The tiny mission station had been transformed into a graveyard. Inside the defenses, the surviving British soldiers were completely drained. Many could barely stand after fighting almost non-stop through the night. Their faces were dark with smoke and exhaustion. Some wandered silently through the ruins searching for wounded comrades. Others simply sat on the ground in disbelief that they were still alive. The cost of survival had been enormous. Around 17 British defenders were killed, while many more were wounded. The Zulu casualties were far higher, with estimates ranging from 350 to over 500 dead, though some historians believe the number may have been even greater. Yet despite the bloodshed, the battle became one of the most famous last stands in military history. For the British Empire, Rorke's Drift became a story of discipline, courage, and survival against impossible odds. For the Zulu kingdom under King Cetshwayo Kampande, the war showed the world the terrifying power and bravery of Zulu warriors. Even British soldiers who survived the battle later admitted they had never faced fighters so fearless. Today, more than a century later, the Battle of Rorke's Drift is still remembered because it was more than just a battle. It was a collision between an expanding empire and a proud African kingdom. A night where 150 men stood against thousands. A battlefield where courage existed on both sides. And a reminder that history is often written not only by victories, but by the people who somehow survive impossible nights.